We're looking at the Jacob stories. This is actually the Toledot of Isaac, but of course it's really the stories mostly about Jacob and what happened to Isaac through Jacob. We've also noticed already that Jacob is a scoundrel, and we're going to see how God is going to deal with him. As we noticed, of course, the structure of the Jacob stories is much like the structure of the Abram stories. We have a chiasm in which we begin with an oracle of promise. God speaks, in this case, to his mother, and we see that the older shall serve the younger. We understand then that Jacob is the child of promise. That, of course, is a bit of a mystery to the family as they struggle through this, but as Jacob heads north to Haran, he is met by messengers, by angels of God, and God has given him the promise from God. So we see clearly that God is choosing Jacob to be the one through whom the families of the earth will be blessed. The center of this chiasm will be God blessing him in tangible ways, but the question becomes whether Jacob will accept this and really bow before God as his God, even though he says he will. God will bring him back. God is going to work in him, and we will see how that works until finally the oracle is fulfilled. Jacob submits to God and becomes Israel in chapter 35. The point of seeing the structure in this narrative is to see the message that God is trying to communicate through these narratives, or the stories put together into a single narrative. It begins with the oracle of promise, which means that, of course, Jacob is the child through whom the blessing will come. It's the one through whom God is going to bring his promise of seed and blessing and promise through to Abram. The characters don't seem to necessarily recognize that, but that's God's intent, and that's the reader's understanding, which means that as we walk through these various conflicts, the reader really knows what's going to happen. The reader really understands how it's going to come out, but it is a confusing thing simply because Jacob is such a character and such a conniver. As we walk through the narrative, then the center shows us that God is at work. The fertility of the wives and the flocks is acknowledged by the angel, by Jacob, by the wives. It's acknowledged even in the following narrative by Laban. So we see clearly that it is God at work, even though as we walk through the first half, it appears that it is Jacob who's trying to do these things all on his own, and is trying, but actually the success is coming because of God at work. It's also highlighted by the messengers in chapter 28, as we will see, and it's highlighted by how God deals with him through messengers as he heads home in 32 and 33, and then finally, of course, the fulfillment at the end as he bows before God and becomes Israel. But the message is the point here in terms of God being at work, making his man what he wants him to be so that he can bring the blessing that he wants to bring, so that he can accomplish through him the blessing to the people around him. In these stories, as we see in the Abram stories, the matriarch, Rebekah, is barren just as Sarah was barren. Again, just as with Sarah, it is clearly showing that this is God at work. This child is a supernatural child. Of course, when she gets pregnant, she seems to have this struggle going on inside, and she's really concerned about these babies inside of her, and so she comes to God. And God gives her an oracle in verse 23 of chapter 25. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. What God does here is clearly show that his choice is the younger child. This is not just a promise of what's going to happen, but this is the promise of what God wills to happen. So it's God's choice of Jacob, and helping us to understand what's going to happen in terms of the working of God. What it will do is set up the narrative and provide then the background by which we see what Jacob connives to do and what God superintends, and even using the poor choices and evil actions, if you will, or evil motives of people in the narrative to accomplish God's ends. When we think about these 2 characters, we have 2 that are really characters. We have Jacob, who, as we look at him, we see him as wily and unscrupulous, and certainly he is. But on the other hand, what we don't always, or at least often, think about is the fact that he values what is valuable. He actually values the promise and blessing of God. On the other hand, we see a man's man. We see Esau, the hunter, but we also recognize that he is profane in the sense of being common. He's secular, he's irreligious. We see it in who he marries, not just in what he does or how he responds to Jacob, but we also see, and this is the most important thing here really, is that he does not value what is valuable. And so his birthright to him is of no value. So when he comes and he is crying to Isaac later that he's lost his blessing and Jacob has stolen it, it's partly true, but it's also partly not true, because we recognize that perhaps Esau is less to be pitied than we may think. And Jacob, God is going to have to work in his life. So the people God chooses and uses aren't always perfect people. In fact, as Paul says, he often chooses the weak and the ones that seem to be the foolish ones, but he will use them to shame the wise. So here we have another example of that in Jacob, who is initially a conniver, and yet God is going to have to work in his life through a lot of pain and a lot of struggle to bring him to a point where God can use him. Chapter 26 seems like it interrupts the story as we start with the two children, and then all of a sudden we've got um, Isaac and Rebekah in trouble here in Gerar. However, the need for this chapter is important here in the flow of the narrative simply because what God does in chapter 26 is he makes sure the reader understands by giving us this narrative that he is physically and clearly passed the promise of Abram on to Isaac. And so it is Isaac's to give, as he is the one who will be blessing in chapter 27. So it's clearly showing the working of God again. And we see in this also the fact that Isaac hasn't fallen very far from the tree. We see that Isaac is not particularly pursuing God either. That's really chapters 26 and 27. It's very, we really have very little about Isaac. It's kind of in these two chapters. In 26, he is passing his wife off as his sister, just like his dad did. And in chapter 27, we see him wanting to bless the wrong young man, which is probably contrary to the knowledge that he had from the oracle that to his wife. So here we see God is clearly passing on the promise. He's passing on the blessing. He makes sure that he stays here because this is the land of promise. And then he gives him the clear promises of the land, seed, and blessing of Abram. So what we see in this chapter really is faith in the extent that he receives the promise and he does what God says, but we begin to recognize that there are some flaws in the family that God is going to have to work through as he brings the promise through the family of Abram, Isaac, and Israel. So when we come to the Jacob stories, one of the questions that we often ask, and actually I listed several here, but how on earth is the youngest going to get the promise? That was the oracle, and it seems as if it is by the conniving of Jacob and Jacob's mother. On the other hand, we've already noticed that this is really God's promise from the beginning, and so we have to try to put these things together. It seems as if Jacob and his mother are perhaps trying to work out in their own way, in their flesh, what God has promised supernaturally. How would it have worked otherwise? Well, we don't know, but what we do know is that God will use this. On the other hand, it seems as if there's a question, at least from our perspective, as to what the difference is between birthright and blessing. In chapter 25, Jacob seems to, in Esau's words at least, steal the birthright when he takes advantage of Esau's lusts and of Esau's hunger. And Esau seems to think he's going to die of starvation because he hasn't eaten in a few hours. And here Jacob takes advantage of that and gets him to sell what he doesn't value, what Esau does not value, for a bowl of soup, even though Jacob values it and later Esau will as well. And then, of course, in chapter 27 becomes the issue of blessing. So what's really the difference here? And what we have, and I believe what's clear in the text and what we see in the ancient world as well, is that the birthright is the double portion, and that's what you expect as the oldest child. And that's what Jacob steals initially, or what Esau sells to Jacob initially. But when we get to chapter 27, what we're talking about here in terms of blessing is God's promise. And we'll see that very clearly in chapter 28. So the reason chapter 26 intervenes is because it is showing us that that promise is Isaac's to give. So The difference is going to come front and center when Isaac promises to give the blessing to Esau if he will bring him that proverbial bowl of soup again. And what we see is the ruling of the stomach again. The appetite seems to be front and center. So what was Isaac thinking? Well, that's another interesting question that I think we have to ask, because it's as if Isaac doesn't remember the promise that was made through the oracle. And in his old age, he's willing to bless the one that he likes the best, based upon what he wants the most. But again, God will intervene, but in this case, he's going to do it through the poor choices of Rebekah and Jacob, and those poor choices are going to cost Rebekah and Jacob. They're going to both have to lose one another. Jacob's going to have to flee for 20 years, and we're going to see just a significant personal loss for both of them because of their unwillingness to really trust God. Jacob doesn't seem to get the point until finally in chapter 28, as we will see. And what we see when Esau comes and reveals himself, actually in chapter 27, is that he looks at Esau in a new way. Esau is complaining that Jacob has stolen this from him. And in the middle of Jacob's response to Esau, it's as if he finally recognizes what's going on. In verse 34, when Isaac hears Esau's voice, realizes who he is, trembles violently, and so on. In verse 34, as soon as he hears the words of his father, he cries out with a bitter voice. I'm sorry, verse 33. Who is this? He says. And he says he's Esau's son. Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it all before you came, and I blessed him? Yes, and he shall be blessed. I think he realized at that point who it was, and in his statement he's saying, wow, this was God at work. I think this is a bit of an acknowledgement that he has been wrong, and he has been trying to bless the wrong child. And of course, then in chapter 28, he's going to give the full blessing to Jacob. So in chapter 28, we see Jacob giving the full blessing of Abram to Jacob. We noticed that already, and of course, the reality here is that Jacob is consciously being blessed by Isaac, and we see at least Isaac's intent that the promise is going to be passed down, which is of course in accord with what the vision or the oracle was to Rebekah. Of course, in the struggle of the narrative, it hasn't been clear to all, but now it seems as if Isaac is finally understanding. On his way north, he stops at Bethel, and at Bethel he sees the angels ascending and descending between the presence of God and himself, and God speaks to him. Basically, the message that God gives him is that God is going to be with him, and he's going to prosper. God will take him and bring him back, and he will be God's man. Jacob's response to that is what's really important here. He makes a vow to God, promising that he will indeed be God's man. God promises him the land, seed, and the blessing, and he says this is going to be the house of God, and I will worship God alone if. In fact, what he says, if God will be with me and keep me in the way that I go and give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I've set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and all that you give me I will give a full tenth to you. So Jacob actually makes a vow, but the vow is dependent upon God bringing him back, and so he's still holding on to some semblance of control here, at least he thinks he is. Based on God's promise then, in Genesis 28, as Jacob heads towards Haran, he has the promise of God, not only of the blessing that through him all the families of the earth will be blessed, that he will be the one to whom God will give the land, the seed, and the blessing, but the result of that, and God's express word to him, is that God is going to be with him, God is going to take care of him, that's protect him, and God is going to bring him back and fulfill the promise. The question now is Jacob going to trust God, or is Jacob going to continue on his own way? And there's a mixed bag. As he moves to Haran, he does find blessing. In fact, he finds a wife very reminiscent of what we see with the servant of Abraham. And that's significant because it is showing that God is at work in the same way. He is generous. He offers 7 years of service for her hand. But of course we see old Whitey, that's what Laban means, is white. And old Whitey is just as crafty, if not more so, than Jacob. And so what he ends up with is 2 wives because of the deception of Laban. Of course, he's not appreciative of that, but it is beginning to see that the very trickery of Jacob is coming back on his own head, and he's getting some of the medicine that he deserves. On the other hand, in the midst of this, and we don't see the whole story yet, but he's going to tell us more about it later, we see that Jacob is being blessed by God in very material ways. In spite of the fact he has 2 wives, they begin to have children, and in the end of chapter 29 and chapter 30, we're going to see that very blessing that God has promised already. So in the first half of the narrative, from chapter 25 really up here through chapter 30, we've seen God at work. We've seen God doing what he's promised. We've seen his oracle and that he's there, and yet we've also struggled with the character of this guy that God has chosen and God is going to use. What we do see, though, is we see that God is going to have to do a lot of work before he's really ready to be used by God to bring blessing to all the families of the earth. Instead, all he seems to be doing is damage to those around him. And of course, God is in the process of redeeming. He will redeem individuals and he will redeem people, just like he redeems this one that he's chosen called Jacob, who is going to be called Israel.